Hello. This is a very special day because this is also, 27th of July. It's a special day because it also marks the anniversary of a letter. Now, very often people mark the anniversaries of somebody's birth or death or the publication of a book, which is something that I do intend to do a few months later. But today I'm marking the 110th anniversary of a letter that was written by Siegfried Sassoon. Many of you will know of him as a war poet. And Siegfried Sassoon, of course, he served in the First World War and he survived, unlike Wilfred Owen, unlike Rupert Brooke. Anyway, so he wrote a letter dated 27th of July 1911. So today marks the 110th anniversary of that letter. So I thought that I might as well talk a little bit about that letter, but much, much more about the person to whom that letter was written. So this is going to be my video for today. Now, the letter that Siegfried Sassoon wrote, this is what it says over here. And I'm not going to read out the entire letter, but this is what a bit of it says. Until I read The Intermediate Sex, I knew absolutely nothing of that subject, open round brackets, and was entirely unspotted as I am now, close round brackets. But life was an empty thing, and what ideas I had about homosexuality were absolutely prejudiced, and I was in such a groove that I couldn't allow myself to be what I wished to be. And the intense attraction I felt for my own sex was almost a subconscious thing, and my antipathy for women a mystery to me. I cannot say what the intermediate sex, has done for me. I am a different being and have a definite aim in life and something to lean on. So this is a letter that Siegfried Sassoon wrote to Edward Carpenter. Edward Carpenter had published, this letter was written in 1911, and Edward Carpenter had published his book The Intermediate Sex in 1908. Now, the reason why I have been thinking about Edward Carpenter recently is because I have been asked to write on him in conjunction with a novel whose 50th anniversary, some of us will be marking in October, because it was on the 7th of October, 1971, that E.M. Forster's novel Morris was published. So maybe in October, I might make one or two videos on Morris to mark the golden jubilee of the publication of Morris. But be that as it may, today what I intend to do is talk about Edward Carpenter a little bit. Now, those of us who are in India, we would be interested to know that Edward Carpenter is somebody who was known to Gandhiji. So he was known to Mahatma Gandhi, and we find a fairly detailed, not sufficiently detailed, but a reasonably detailed account of Gandhiji's sort of reading of Edward Carpenter in this book. This is a book, I don't know, the light is terrible today, but I don't know whether you can see it. You probably can't. Anyway, so this book is called Anticolonial Thought and the Politics of Friendship, and the name of the book is Affective Communities. It's a collection of essays by Leela Gandhi, who I think is probably the granddaughter of Gandhiji. Anyway, the part that I would want to read out from this book is, this is what she says. She says in 1889, Carpenter wrote his polemical Civilization, Its Cause and Cure. Diagnosing imperial Europe as perilously diseased with civilization, Carpenter's book continually asserts the superiority of savage and barbarian societies, prescribing a cure for the West in a fresh influx of savagery. Now, she goes on to say that by some coincidence, it fell into the hands of the young M.K. Gandhi during a 4-month visit to London in 1909. Remember that 1909, right? So this is actually the year after the year after the publication of The Intermediate Sex. So there is some possibility that Gandhiji may have been aware of this book, but we don't know whether he's actually read it or not. And so, to be regarded in due time as the key manifesto of the Gandhian revolution, Hind Swaraj acknowledges Carpenter along with a few other like-minded writers in its brief bibliography. He is also cited en passant in the text. A great English writer, Gandhi announces in a chapter on civilization, has written a work called Civilization, Its Cause and Cure. Therein, he has called it a disease. Well, Leela Gandhi goes on to say, hardly evidence to give Carpenter pride of place at the formative origins of Indian and anti-colonialism, but evidence enough to note his welcomed presence at its origins, at these origins. Okay, so therefore we know that Gandhiji was definitely aware of Edward Carpenter. He had read Carpenter's book, Civilization, Its Causes and Cure. We do not know whether Gandhiji was aware of Edward Carpenter's book, The Intermediate Sex, which is what I'm going to talk about today. However, were they aware of each other's presence? Yes, because Gandhiji had actually written to Edward Carpenter. We have that letter. So Gandhiji had written to Edward Carpenter, and in the letter, he asks Carpenter if Kallenbach, Gandhiji's friend, can stay at Edward Carpenter's cottage in Millthorpe. Now, what we really should note over here, I'm not trying to suggest anything, but what one should note over here is that Edward Carpenter's cottage in Millthorpe had by that time become quite a pilgrimage spot for gay men mostly. So for homosexual men, possibly some lesbians, definitely people from the women's movement, so suffragists, sort of those who were sort of agitating for women's rights, they would very frequently pay a visit to Millthorpe, and it would be to Millthorpe, of course, that E.M. Forster would go. That is where E.M. Forster would get the idea to write the novel Morris, because, of course, Edward Carpenter was living in Millthorpe at this time openly with another man as his lover, somebody called George Merrill, who was a working class person. And Edward Carpenter had completely forsaken, he had actually declassed himself, if you can think about it like that. He had declassed himself, and he was living with George Merrill in this village. And there was talk about what these two men were up to, but they never actually faced anything like a homophobic attack or anything. I think people just sort of got on with their lives. But I think what the villagers noted is that there would be this constant stream of people who would come and pay homage at Edward Carpenter's feet, and Edward Carpenter would just be sitting there and, sort of receiving these people. And many people visited, including George Bernard Shaw, and of course E.M. Forster. Now, what I really hope to do today is very quickly sort of summarize what Edward Carpenter is saying in The Intermediate Sex. Now, those of you who are interested, the book is available as an audiobook right here on YouTube, so you can read it there. And I have ordered a copy on the internet, and I'm hoping that the copy will be delivered to me on Friday, so I can actually read the book as a physical artifact. But you can certainly listen to the book, which is what I did. Now, listening to the book was interesting, because while one cannot deny the historical significance of Edward Carpenter, I think it's a very, very important book. Let me tell you first about the ways in which I liked the book. So I liked the book because Edward Carpenter is consistently and very frequently, he is sort of making common cause, as it were, between the gay rights movement. I mean, obviously, he doesn't call it the gay rights movement. He calls it, he's basically arguing the case of the homogenic people. Yes, and he has his own terms for it. He has coined the term U-rings, which I think he uses as an adjective. So U-ring men, U-ring women, and the noun that he has formed is Uranian. And he distinguishes the Uranians, strangely enough, from the degenerates and from the homosexuals. And this is where I think Edward Carpenter becomes a little problematic. But I'll come to the problem part of him later. But the good part of him is that he is arguing for vegetarianism elsewhere. And he also sort of mentions it in passing in the introduction. He is making common cause, as I said, with the women's movement, because he acknowledges that perhaps there is a similarity between what the women's movement is trying to achieve and what Edward Carpenter is trying to achieve. He certainly is arguing for sex education. He believes that sex education is not perhaps possible in the big schools, but he wants it to be carried out in small schools. So he's doing all of that. I think there are a couple of other things that he mentions. He gives you a whole list of. He creates some kind of a queer genealogy, as it were. So he names names. So there's a lot of name dropping that is going on. Many of you would be interested to know that not only does he talk about the usual suspects like Michelangelo and sort of Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare. But he also talks about Tennyson in memoriam, so that is also mentioned very clearly. Not that he's trying to suggest that Tennyson was a homosexual, but he's certainly sort of conscripting Tennyson, as it were, to the cause of the homogenic people. And of course, there are two people who recur in the book repeatedly. One, of course, is Walt Whitman, especially for Leaves of Grass. Edward Carpenter, incidentally, actually went over to America and even spent time with Walt Whitman. So Walt Whitman is referred to repeatedly in the book, and also somebody called John Addington Symonds, Symonds. Now, John Addington Symonds was also quite keen on Walt Whitman, and John Addington Symonds is also credited with having translated the homoerotic sonnets of Michelangelo. He was doing that in the Victorian period. So he also definitely talks about the way in which the law should get out of the private space. So he argues about that too. He says that the law has got absolutely no place in the private lives of people. He also raises certain questions, which I think, he was saying that these questions are being discussed a lot these days. And when he talks about these days, he's talking about 1908. None of us are aware that these questions were being discussed, but apparently they were. But look at the way in which history is presented to us, that we are not aware that these things were discussed. What are the questions that he says are being discussed? Okay, so he says, how, for instance, is monogamy natural or artificial? To what degree would marriage be permanent if the law did not make it so, right? And whether jealousy is a necessary accompaniment of love. Remember that he's actually asking these questions in 1908. I'm repeating the date because I myself am astonished that he was talking about these things, which we are now talking about all over again in 2021, when we were talking about polyamory, when we were talking about the validation of promiscuity. So he is already talking about it, in the first decade of the 20th century. So there are certain very important sort of aspects to this book which make it very, very attractive for me. He is also sort of arguing for relationships between teachers and students, not necessarily sexual ones, because again he makes a very clear distinction between the Uranians and the homosexuals or the degenerates. It's very interesting that many of you would be interested to know that he regards Edward II as somebody not, what is it that I have written over here? I can't even read. Not wanting in nobility. So he clearly regards Edward II as being somebody who's noble, but he regards James the First, that is to say James the Sixth of Scotland, as somebody who's degenerate. If you try to unpack it, what it basically means is that James the First was regarded as effeminate, right? Because he was not interested in warfare. He was he was clumsy. He wasn't terribly attractive to look at. He was only reading books and all of that. So therefore, he is regarded as a degenerate, and also because he very openly flaunted his men, the men that he was in love with. So James the First would very openly display these men that he was having relationships with, whether it be Robert Carr or whether it be George Villiers, who he subsequently made the Duke of Buckingham. So therefore, James the First was somebody who was very open about his sexuality, and Edward II was also, but for some strange reason, Edward II is a good king and James the First is a bad one. Be that as it may, the troubling part of the book is that he is, again, unconsciously patriarchal, in the sense that he is somebody who he has a preference for Uranians who conform to a certain accepted gender presentation. So he wants homosexual men. Of course, he does not call them homosexual, Uranians, or yearning men. So he wants yearning men to be like normal men, and he wants the lesbian women to be like normal women. So there is a kind of gender conformity that we find in Edward Carpenter. Also, what I think is important is that he is somebody who privileges love over sex. And he's constantly at pains to say repeatedly that I don't think that the Uranians are interested in sex very much. They're much more interested in love. So he clearly denigrates physical side of homosexuality, and he's constantly celebrating the spiritual, the emotional side. So that is the one hierarchy. The second hierarchy is that he is constantly privileging the emotional over the sentimental. So he says that, that he abhors sentimentality, but he's all for emotion. I'm not terribly sure how he manages that differentiation, because the way in which he describes it, they seem to be pretty much coterminous, but that is what he does. And also what he is doing is that he is at pains to say that Uranians are a developed, a more evolved species of human beings, because they combine the male and the female in themselves. So he doesn't seem to suggest, he says it very, very clearly, that apparently Uranians can contribute to society in a major way, because they can explain the men to the women and women to the men. So it is almost as though they work as sort of translators on both sides. They are translating, the homosexual men are translating men to the women, and they're translating women to the men, because apparently in them they embody the masculine and the feminine. I don't know where he got that from, but that is what he's saying. So what we really find then is this astonishing kind of book, not terribly well researched, in the sense that he talks a little bit about the science of it, but just sort of very quickly. But he begins the book by saying that I'm not trying to somehow make the case that Uranians are somehow better than normal people, but that is exactly what he goes on to say, is that Uranians are actually better than the normal people, because they're more evolved, because they contain both the sexes in themselves. It's a book that certainly dates. It's a book that we are going to read not without cringing at certain points. But I think what we really have to remember is that this was one of the earliest attempts at what shall I say, pleading the case for gay people, and I think for that reason it deserves a little bit of attention. The reason why I am thinking about E.M. Forster also in this context is because, as I told you, that E.M. Forster went and visited Edward Carpenter, and as a result of that visit, the novel Morris was born. That is going to be the subject of my next video, in which I shall talk about the way in which Edward Carpenter's work may have actually influenced Morris. It's something that I'm just reading up on. There are books that I have which are going to help me. So I'm very grateful for Francis King's book, E.M. Forster and His World, which I think is very, very useful. I'm also being helped by P.N. Fairbank's rather magisterial two-volume book, which has been combined into one. And of course, there is Leela Gandhi, but then there are some other books as well that I would taking the help of. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm sorry about the very poor picture quality because it's pretty cloudy and overcast, and which is why I'm not getting the sun on my face as much as I would like. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this, and I shall see you again very soon.